Hey TCS TV viewers, it's Dave from the camera store. Today we're talking about the Tamron 35-150 F2-2.8. This is the Tamron 35-150 2-2.8 Di3 VXD lens. Now there's a lot going on with this lens. We're going to get into all the different features and functions, but first let's talk about what this range is sort of for. This is a relatively unique focal range. We don't see this too often. Typically we have a 24-70 and a 70-200, but this is a 35-150. It's kind of a little bit of both of those lenses mixed into one, with a very bright aperture at f2 at 35, all the way up to 2.8 on the 150 side of things. There's a lot going on with this lens, so let's get into it. When you first get your hands on this lens, it is a relatively big, it is a relatively chunky lens. It's 1,158 grams, or just a little over 41 ounces. As far as the size goes, it is rocking an 82mm filter thread and comes in a little over 6 inches or 158 millimeters long. So it does have some size and some weight to it. When you mount this lens on a body such as the A7 IV, I do find a little on the front heavy if I'm just holding the body on its own. However, I'm holding the lens and having proper shooting technique, I find it reasonably well balanced and it's working for me. Now let's get into some of the controls of the lens itself. First off, it is a zoom lens, so we have a nice big zoom ring. What I like about the zoom ring is it's a relatively short throw. At about 60 degrees, we go from 35 to 150. That means I can quickly move the lens from one framing option to another framing option without having to really rack things around. Now just past that, we do get a couple different controls. If you look around the lens here, we have a couple push buttons here, a custom 1, 2, and 3, and the autofocus manual focus switch. Now these custom controls are very cool because this lens doesn't need the tap console like previous lenses did. This lens has a built-in USB-C port, which is very cool because I can plug it into my computer, run the Tamron software, and customize these controls as much as I want. So cool, in fact, if I never use this as a manual focus ring and I want to use it for my aperture, I can swap that ring over to my aperture instead. Very cool to be able to customize a lens like this and make it much more of a personal experience for what works in your workflow. Now this lens does come with weather sealing, which is very nice, including the USB-C port that you don't have to worry about putting a cover on that or getting that wet. Now we do have a fluorine coating on the front element there, which is very good for helping keep this lens clean, and they do come supplied with a hood. I have to give Tamron credit for the design of this lens. Now it is a little bit bigger, of course, but what they've done is they've put all the buttons and the controls are somewhat recessed. There's no really sharp edges on this lens whatsoever. So when you're handling it, it feels very comfortable in your hand. You don't have to worry about accidentally scratching yourself or anything like that. Now I do find that the switches are of high quality. And the last thing I want to talk about with this lens is that there is a lock here for the zoom. So if I am walking around with this lens, because there's no tripod collar with this lens, it is going to be bouncing off the end of the camera like this. So I'm using a Peak Design strap today. I'm glad they put this lens lock in here because I am finding as I'm walking around with this setup, there is some lens creep happening. So it's nice to be able to lock that off when I'm walking around. Because of the focal range of this lens going up to 150, there's going to be a lot of cases where we want to use this for indoor sports or places where autofocus speed and how to acquire autofocus very quickly is very crucial for capturing those fleeting moments. And here, Tamron has thrown their best motors into this. And this is the VXD lens. This is the Voice Coil Extreme Torque Drive is what that stands for. Now that's a fantastic name, Tamron. I can't see what you're going to up that with next time. So what Tamron is doing is using a linear autofocus motor like we are seeing in so many other lenses nowadays. And instead of rotating the focusing elements around to achieve focus, they're pushing and pulling them back in a straight line. They can achieve focus much faster and improved accuracy, and I'm finding the focus accuracy is great on here. Now I'm just going to borrow two of the ladies from the famous 5 here in Canada here, and you can hear the autofocus, how quick this focuses. But don't take my word for it. Take a look at our wall test here, and you can put up with more of me doing all kinds of crazy things in front of the camera here, and you can see just how fast this lens snaps the focus and follows along. Well, let's talk about image quality now. I mean, obviously I like the build quality of this lens and I like the focusing speed, but how good is the image quality that this lens is able to produce? And typically the longer the focal length when it comes to zoom ranges, the weaker we have some certain sections. Now when it comes to this, what I'm pleasantly surprised about with this lens is that the center sharpness throughout the whole range is very, very good. I'm really happy with the results I'm getting through that. But at 35 at f2, that's where it's at its sort of weakest. And if you look at the corner sharpness, we certainly lose a little bit here. Take a look at this wall sample here. When I shot 35mm at f2 wide open, this is when the lens is at its absolute weakest. Center sharpness is very good, but if you compare it with the corner sharpness, we certainly see a big difference here. Now if we stop it down to f4 or even 5.6, we do see an improvement there, but it's not 100% perfect. As you zoom out, we certainly lose a little bit of that, and then certainly if you stop down, we are going to see an improvement with image quality, but not drastically. The center is very good throughout the entire range. I'm very happy about that. When it comes to the optical design of this lens, there's a lot going on inside of here. We have 21 different elements in 15 different groups, including 3 spherical elements, which is really nice to have. We also have a 9-bladed circular aperture, which is going to be crucial for taking advantage of that fast wide aperture and getting that nice creamy bokeh. When it comes to chromatic aberration, and that's that green and magenta hue you see on either side of a very high contrast scene, this lens is fairly well controlled. Now, it's worse when it's at 35 millimeters. You can certainly see it. I do notice though when I am shooting this, you do need to watch, especially on the longer end, flare coming into the lens. So make sure you watch your light sources that are coming in. It's kind of a cool effect if that's what you want to go for, but it's certainly something to be mindful of when you're shooting with this lens. So when I heard about this lens, I thought this might be the perfect lens for me. I spent a long time working with a 24-70 and a 70-200 in a lot of the events that I shoot. And I thought, I don't really go much wider than 35, and it is my favorite focal length. So could this be the perfect lens for me? I only have to bring one lens to cover the entire event. Whether it's a group shot or an individual shot, I've got something that can achieve some very good results. Now, it is certainly a little bit heavier, but it's certainly not as heavy as having to carry 2 lenses or the inconvenience of having to swap lenses over. The big thing for me I'm finding is that, is 35 wide enough for you? If I was going on a vacation, as much as I love my 35 millimeter, sometimes I want to go wider than that. So I'm going to be carrying a second lens around if I treat this kind of as a travel lens. But if you're an event photographer where you find that this focal range is 99% of what you shoot, this is a really cool option to have. And I do find the autofocus system works very good, and the whole overall experience is very positive if you can get over the size and weight of this lens. For the first little while carrying around this lens, I kept finding myself looking for 70-200 scenes because it felt like I was carrying a 70-200 around with me. So it took me a little while to get used to the fact I actually have a 35 millimeter with me as well. I don't need to switch lenses. I've got it with me and I got all the reach that I really need to. The results I'm getting from this lens are great, although I would wish they would have included a few things. I like the option of having a tripod collar and a lens of this size. If I'm using this as a portrait lens, being able to go vertical or horizontal, it'd be really nice to have a tripod collar. And the other thing would possibly be a teleconverter. If I'm traveling with this lens, I can double the range with this lens with a teleconverter and make that quite convenient, but that's not available for this lens. So maybe it's just on a wish list for me. But overall, when I'm using this lens, I'm finding the results that I'm getting, and that's ultimately the goal I want to achieve. How good are my results? And I'm very happy with the look I'm getting with this lens. They're nice and punchy, good contrast. The autofocus never let me down, and I'm really appreciating and loving the quality that I'm getting out of this lens. So if you can accept that this lens is a bit beefy and a little bit chunky, I think you're really going to like it. Now, I've had a great time shooting with this lens, whether it's going for a hike with my kids or shooting some great music acts in a nightclub. But I, of course, want to know what you guys think of this lens. Is this the perfect focal range for you? Do you mind that the size and weight is a little bit heavier than carrying around a smaller lens with a lesser aperture? Let me know in the comments down below. Follow us both on Instagram, and please hit that notification bell and subscribe. We'll catch you again next time. Hey, thanks for sticking around and watching this episode on the 35-150 2-2.8 lens from Tamron. If you want to see more of our recent content, click up here. And if you are Canadian, you want to support local, check out thecamerastore.com down here.